unaware of her 300 million inheritance. Her in-laws threw her and her triplets out after her husband died. The storm had rolled in without mercy that evening, clouds pressing low over the jagged Vermont hills, the sky bruised and swollen. Fat raindrops pelted the windshield of Evelyn Harper Duval's aging Toyota Crown, each one exploding into 1,000 silver beads before streaking down into the wiper's frantic sweep. Beyond the glass, she could see them, her husband's family, standing at the mouth of the gravel drive, their silhouettes lit by the porch lanterns. One by one, they hurled her belongings into the cold, muddy puddles. A box of children's books, the crocheted blanket Samuel's grandmother had made for their wedding, her favorite tea kettle wrapped in a towel that now lay soaking in the brown water. In the back seat, her 4-year-old triplets, Clara, James, and Rosalind, sat wedged together beneath a fleece blanket that smelled faintly of baby shampoo. Their eyes followed every movement outside with the stunned stillness of children who hadn't yet decided if this was a nightmare or real life. "Mommy," Clara's voice was thin, cracking at the edges. "Why is Grandma throwing our teddy bears in the water?" The question punched a hole straight through Evelyn's chest. She forced her gaze forward, refusing to let her children see the tears gathering in her eyes. Her hands clenched the steering wheel, fingertips white, palms slick. This was the same drive she had rolled up for years earlier, the hospital's plastic bassinet in the back, her husband Samuel Duval grinning as he promised. "This is where we'll raise them, Eve. Forever starts here." Forever had lasted exactly 3 days past Samuel's burial. Hello, my beautiful story family. Before we dive deeper into Evelyn's incredible story, a tale of betrayal, hidden fortune, and an unthinkable fight for justice, I'd like to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. And honestly, if this story touches you the way I think it will, may want to subscribe to our channel, because what happens next will leave you speechless. From the shelter of the porch, Beatrice Duval, Samuel's mother, watched with unblinking eyes, her pearl earrings catching the yellow porch light. She cradled a steaming mug of chamomile tea, holding it like an ornament rather than something to drink. Once, those hands had cupped Evelyn's cheeks in the hospital, whispering congratulations as she welcomed her grandchildren into the world. Now, those same hands were waving her away. "You have 1 hour to collect the rest and leave," Beatrice said, her tone as cold as the wind slicing in off the lake. "This house belongs to the Duval family. You were never truly one of us." Rainwater ran down Evelyn's neck, soaking the collar of her coat. She stared at the porch steps where she had once sat with Samuel, barefoot in summer, sipping wine and making plans for the future. Beside Beatrice, Victor Duval, Samuel's elder brother, stood immaculate in a navy cashmere coat, his posture rigid as a sentry's. Not a drop of rain had dared touch him. "Let's not drag this out," Victor said, his voice smooth but laced with contempt. "We all know why you married my brother. And here's your surprise, there's nothing left. The hospital bills. The specialists. They drained it all." Evelyn felt her stomach twist. Nothing left? Samuel had sworn their future was secure, that the triplets' trust funds were ironclad, that she'd never have to worry. But the words kept coming, each one stripping away another layer of the life she thought she'd built. The triplets' muffled sobs rose from the back seat. James was crying for his daddy now, hiccuping between sobs, his small fist clutching the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. Evelyn stepped forward, rainwater dripping from the ends of her hair. "Please, at least let me take something of Samuel's. For the children. They've already lost their father. Don't take their memories too." Beatrice's gaze did not waver. "You have your car, your clothes, and those children. That's more than you arrived with." The words landed like a slap. She stood there, the rain plastering her coat to her body, and for the first time, Evelyn felt the truth crawl beneath her skin. This was not just grief or cruelty. Something was wrong. Samuel had been distant in those final months, not about money, but about something else. She remembered the way he'd gripped her hand in the hospital bed, his voice low and strained, telling her there was a box in Lawrence's office. She dismissed it then, thinking the morphine had blurred his mind. Now she wasn't so sure. That night, drenched to the bone and clutching 3 crying children to her sides, Evelyn Fontaine began to wonder if her husband had taken more than just his last breath to the grave. Perhaps he'd taken the key to something that could change everything. 2 weeks later, Evelyn sat cross-legged on the worn carpet of a cramped 1-bedroom apartment above a shuttered bakery in Burlington. The smell of yeast and sugar still clung faintly to the old floorboards, but now it mixed with the sharper scent of damp laundry hanging to dry on a folding rack near the window. It had taken nearly every dollar of her dwindling savings to secure this place. The triplets shared the pull-out couch in the living room. Clara on one side, Rosalind curled up against her, James sprawled at their feet with his blanket bunched under his chin. The children had stopped asking when they could go back to the big house. Evelyn didn't know if that was acceptance or the beginnings of forgetting. The radiator hissed and clanked. Outside, snow was beginning to swirl through the glow of the street lamps. Her phone buzzed, another past due notice. She let it go dark without answering. Soon was what the temp agency kept promising her, but soon didn't pay for groceries or the heating oil that was running low. She'd sold her wedding ring the week before. The simple gold band Samuel had slipped onto her finger in a small chapel on a hill was now nothing more than $138.47 in her checking account. Evelyn had been a fighter long before she met Samuel. She grew up in foster homes scattered across 3 counties, never staying long enough in one place to make friends. She learned early that no one was coming to rescue her. If she wanted something, she'd have to work for it herself. At 17, she cleaned motel rooms and stocked grocery shelves to pay her way through community college. By 22, she'd scraped together enough to enroll in nursing school, often sleeping in her car between overnight shifts and early classes. Samuel had come into her life when she was working the ER at Green Mountain Medical Center. She'd been running on 3 hours of sleep, juggling a double shift when she noticed him, tall, slightly disheveled, with a smile that softened the edges of the world. He was there visiting his father after surgery, but instead of hovering in the corner, Samuel had drifted over to where she was restocking supplies. "You look like you could use coffee more than I do," he'd said, holding out a paper cup from the cafe downstairs. It wasn't a line. His voice was warm, steady. And when she took the cup, their fingers brushed. Not an accident, not exactly intentional, but enough to lodge the moment in her memory. Over the weeks that followed, he found reasons to stop by. Sometimes with muffins, sometimes just with stories about growing up in the Duval estate, running through the orchards with his older brother chasing him. He never flaunted the wealth he came from. In fact, he seemed slightly embarrassed by it. They had their first date at a little diner outside town, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and pie under glass domes. She ordered soup and coffee, he ordered pancakes and made her laugh so hard she spilled cream into her lap. "You're going to change the world, Evelyn Fontaine," he told her on their second date, using the name she'd carried before marriage. "And I want a front row seat when you do." For the first time in her life, she felt like someone saw her, not just her exhaustion or her guard, but her potential. They married 18 months later under the beech trees behind the Duval estate. By then, she had met Beatrice, who smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, and Victor, whose handshake lingered just long enough to feel like a silent judgment. Samuel handled all the finances from the start. He insisted she focus on her career, and later on the babies. She didn't mind, she trusted him completely. But things began to change after his diagnosis. There were mysterious phone calls at odd hours, conversations that went quiet when she walked into the room. Samuel began locking his study and carrying his laptop everywhere, even into the bedroom. She noticed men in expensive coats arriving in black sedans, speaking with him in low voices. He'd explain them away as insurance agents, specialists, or legal advisors helping to manage the mounting medical expenses. Yet there was one visitor she could never quite place, Lawrence Keaton, Samuel's closest friend from his university days and godfather to the triplets. He had been a regular fixture at their Sunday dinners, always quick with a joke for the children, until 6 months before the funeral, when he simply stopped coming. Evelyn had called him twice after Samuel's death, left voicemails. He never called back. That night in the apartment, the radiator ticking in the quiet, Rosalind stirred on the pull-out couch and whispered, "Daddy," still half in her dreams. Evelyn smoothed her daughter's hair. "No, sweetheart. It's Mommy. Is Daddy coming back?" The question sliced into her. How do you tell a 4-year-old that forever doesn't always mean what it should? James, eyes still closed, mumbled. "Grandma said Daddy used all the money. She said we're poor now." Evelyn's jaw tightened. She'd told Beatrice to leave the children out of adult matters, but clearly, that boundary had meant nothing. "We have everything we need," she said softly, though her empty pantry told a different story. "We have each other. That's what matters." But deep down, she couldn't believe Samuel had left them with nothing. The man who planned every detail of their lives, who read financial magazines like they were novels, who once told her he'd make sure their children never wanted for anything. No, something wasn't adding up. When her phone buzzed again that night, it wasn't another creditor. It was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, then answered. "Evelyn, it's Lawrence Keaton." Her pulse spiked. "Lawrence? Where have you been? I tried calling after." "I know. I'm sorry. But there are things about Samuel, things his family doesn't know. Things you need to know." She stood, heart hammering. "What things?" "The kind that will change everything. Can you meet me at my office tonight? And, Evelyn, don't tell anyone you're coming. Not anyone." As she hung up, for the first time in weeks, something unfamiliar sparked in her chest. Hope. Snow flurries drifted down like ash as Evelyn stepped out of the bus and looked up at the tall brick and glass building. It had been a month since Samuel's funeral, a month of waking up in the cramped apartment above the old bakery, a month of pawning whatever she could to keep the heat on, a month of swallowing her pride while the Duval family moved on as if she and the children didn't exist. The days had blurred together, laundry strung across the radiator to dry, dinners of canned soup, Clara asking when they could go home, and James pretending not to hear. Evelyn had even stopped expecting her phone to ring. No one called anymore. Until tonight. Lawrence Keaton's voice over the line had been the last thing she expected to hear. She called him twice after the funeral. Once the night she was thrown out, and once 2 weeks later, when the shock had worn into a hollow ache. Both times there'd been no answer. Now, out of nowhere, he wanted to meet. And not tomorrow. Tonight. The lobby of Keaton and Whitmore Private Wealth Advisory was warm and hushed, the kind of quiet that made her boots sound too loud against the polished marble. A security guard waved her toward the elevators without asking her name. In the mirrored walls of the lift, she caught her own reflection. Hair pulled back too tightly, dark circles under her eyes, thrift store coat pulled at the waist. She looked like someone bracing for bad news. The elevator opened onto the 17th floor. Plush blue carpet muffled her steps as she walked past darkened offices and framed photographs of mountain peaks and sailboats cutting through open water. At the far end, in gold leaf on frosted glass, was Lawrence Keaton. Inside, the room was awash in the amber glow of a desk lamp and the flicker of a fire in the hearth. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, and beyond the tall windows, Lake Champlain lay under a sheet of black ice. Lawrence rose from behind a mahogany desk, looking older and sharper than she remembered. The boyish charm he once carried to Sunday dinners was gone. In its place was something taut, deliberate. "Evelyn," he said, crossing the room. "I wasn't sure you'd come." She shrugged off her coat but didn't sit. "It's been a month. I called you twice after the funeral. You never called back. Now you say there's something I need to know about Samuel? You'd better make this worth it." His jaw tightened, as though he'd expected the accusation. He glanced toward the door, then the windows, before finally gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." When she did, he didn't start right away. Instead, he walked to the far wall where a framed map of the lake hung. With a practiced movement, he lifted it down to reveal a digital safe. The keypad beeped softly under his touch, and with a metallic click, the door swung open. From inside, he withdrew a thick leather portfolio and a small brass key. Both looked ordinary, but the way he handled them made Evelyn's pulse quicken. "Samuel made me promise to wait 30 days after his funeral before I came to you," Lawrence said, setting the items on the desk. She frowned. "Why 30 days? "Because he didn't trust the people closest to him," Lawrence replied. "He knew they'd be watching you, and he wanted them to believe there was nothing left worth taking." Lawrence leaned forward, his voice low. Samuel was not the man his family thought he was. They knew about the estate, the business, the accounts they could see. But for the past 15 years, he'd been building something much bigger, quietly and without their knowledge. Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Bigger how?" "Real estate across the country. Early investments in startups that are now worth hundreds of millions. Offshore accounts in your name. And patents from his university days that still earn revenue." He pushed the portfolio toward her. The first page stopped her breath cold. A bank statement with a balance of $58,473,209.11. She turned the page, another account even larger. Then another. "This can't be real," she whispered. "I've been selling everything I could just to keep the heat on. I've sold my wedding ring." "He told you nothing," Lawrence cut in gently. "Because the less you knew, the safer you and the children were." She looked up sharply. "Safe from what?" From his family, he said flatly. A week before he died, Samuel overheard Beatrice and Victor discussing how they could have you declared unfit, take custody of the triplets, and claim the estate for themselves. Evelyn's fingers curled against the armrest. They wanted to take my children. They wanted to take everything, Lawrence said. Samuel wasn't going to give them the chance. She turned more pages. Deeds to a vineyard in Oregon, a cabin in Montana, a Boston townhouse. Stock certificates. Trust fund documents for Clara, James, and Rosalind, each written to ensure that no one but her could touch them. Her hand lingered on her children's names. Why keep me in the dark? Because if they believed you had nothing, they'd let you go, Lawrence said. They'd throw you out and move on. Which is exactly what they did. He slid the brass key toward her. This opens a safety deposit box in Montreal. Samuel told me you'd know when to open it. He never told me what's inside. Evelyn picked it up, the cool metal almost humming in her palm. How much are we talking about, Lawrence? As of last quarter, he said carefully, just over $300 million. The number sat between them like a live wire. Evelyn felt a cold, deliberate focus take root where grief had lived for the past month. They think they've won, she said quietly. Samuel said you might, Lawrence replied, but he also said one day you'd fight back. She slid the portfolio into her bag and rose, gripping the key tightly. Let them believe their lies for now. Let them get comfortable. She met his eyes, her voice steady. And then they'll find out exactly what happens when you try to destroy a woman with nothing left to lose, and 300 million reasons to make you regret it. The calendar on the kitchen wall still hung open to January, even though it was now late February. Evelyn hadn't bothered flipping it over. The month after Samuel's funeral had passed in a haze. Not the comforting haze of forgetting, but the heavy, clinging kind, where every small task took twice the effort. Her new apartment above the bakery on Pine Street smelled faintly of yeast and coffee grounds. It was warmer than the house she'd left behind, but the heat here came from noisy radiators that hissed like they were complaining about the work. She'd started keeping a small notepad beside her bed. At first, she used it to jot grocery lists. Then, after Lawrence handed her the leather portfolio, the lists began to change. Boston townhouse value? Oregon vineyard. Can it be sold quietly? Montreal? Open when safe. By day, she was still the Evelyn the world saw, tired widow, keeping her head down, stretching every dollar. By night, she was someone else entirely, her mind running like a machine, clicking through possibilities. One evening, after putting the triplets to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the portfolio open and the brass key resting beside her teacup. The children's muffled giggles drifted through the thin wall, James whispering some nonsense to make Clara and Rosalind laugh under their blankets. It hit her suddenly. If Samuel had told her the truth years ago, they might have been living a life free of Beatrice's shadow. No pawnshop visits. No eviction. No humiliation in the driveway. Her fingers tightened on the key. The Duvals had taken her comfort, her home, and tried to take her children, and they'd done it smiling. Lawrence had shown her the broad strokes, but she wanted the details. Every property deed, every stock certificate, every offshore account number. She copied them into a notebook in her own hand, using code names so anyone who found it would think it was an old grocery list. She set up the second-hand laptop in the corner of the kitchen, under the pretense of finding remote work. With Lawrence's help, she installed secure software and a VPN that routed her searches through half a dozen countries. Late at night, she combed through public records. She learned which parcels of land were in shell companies tied to Samuel, which investments were split among partners, which accounts could be accessed without drawing attention. She wasn't moving money yet. Not until she knew exactly how much rope she could give the Duvals before they hung themselves. The ad for the Champlain Trust job looked ordinary enough. Part-time assistant, flexible hours, community focus. But when Evelyn saw Robert Ashton's name on the board of trustees, she remembered Samuel's wry tone when mentioning him years ago. Robert knows where the bodies are buried. He just prefers to plant gardens over them now. She applied the same night. At the interview, she played the part of a woman grateful for a chance. Modest blouse, hair pinned back, eyes bright but humble. Robert glanced at her resume, then at her face. "Haven't we met before?" he asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I doubt it. I've lived a quiet life." She got the job. The Champlain Trust was a gift she hadn't expected. Through casual conversations with donors and contractors, Evelyn learned which firms handled discrete transactions, which bankers turned a blind eye to offshore movements, and which journalists were more interested in favors than facts. She didn't need all of them, just enough to form a quiet network, invisible to the Duvals. A week into her new job, Evelyn stopped by a small local bank on her lunch break. She cashed in a Vermont state savings bond in her name, a modest sum, but enough to open a fresh account under Evelyn Hart. It was a small move, one the Duvals would never notice, but it gave her somewhere safe to test quiet deposits. The first brush with the enemy came sooner than she expected. It was a rainy Thursday when a silver Jaguar eased up beside her on Pine Street. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Beatrice's perfectly painted lips. "Evelyn," she said, her voice a mix of mock surprise and disdain. "I assumed you'd left Burlington by now." Evelyn kept walking. "Why would I?" "Because people talk, and you'd be wise to avoid unpleasantness." Evelyn stopped, turning just enough to meet her gaze. The rain beaded on her coat and hair, but she didn't blink. "Funny. I was thinking the same thing." For the first time, Beatrice's smile faltered before she rolled the window up and pulled away. That night, Evelyn stared at the brass key again. Montreal wasn't far, a few hours' drive. Mrs. Hanley downstairs could watch the children. Whatever was inside that safety deposit box, Samuel had believed it important enough to hide even from Lawrence. She placed the key in her palm, feeling the weight of it. If she opened that box, there might be no turning back. But then she thought of the driveway that night. Beatrice's voice. Victor's smirk. The triplets clutching her coat in the cold. Her decision was already made. The morning she decided to go, Burlington was wrapped in a thin veil of fog, as though the lake itself didn't want to be seen. Evelyn rose before the children stirred, moving quietly through the apartment. She laid out breakfast on the counter, bowls, cereal, a jug of milk, so Mrs. Hanley wouldn't have to rummage through cupboards. The brass key was in her coat pocket, warm from being held. Her other hand clutched the worn leather portfolio, now slimmer. She'd left the most sensitive pages hidden under a loose floorboard in the bedroom. She kissed each sleeping child's forehead before slipping out. James stirred but didn't wake. Her bus ticket to Montreal was paid for in cash. She chose the seat by the window, not for the view, but so no one could sit on her right side. She'd learned that keeping one flank against a wall, or glass, meant fewer surprises. The city rolled away behind her. The fog thinned into pale sunlight, and snowbanks flashed past, dirty at the edges from passing cars. Somewhere beyond those fields, the Duvals were probably having breakfast in their heated kitchen, Victor glancing over stock prices while Beatrice read from the society pages. They thought she was licking her wounds in a second-rate apartment, waiting for fate to finish with her. They had no idea she was heading for something Samuel had hidden so completely that even they couldn't sniff it out. She remembered the night he'd told her, in a way that wasn't telling her anything at all. They'd been sitting on the porch, the triplets asleep upstairs. Samuel had sipped his whiskey, watching the light fade from the lake. "Some things," he'd said, "are worth keeping off the books. Not because they're illegal, but because they're ours." She hadn't asked then. Now she wished she had. By the time the bus pulled into Montreal's Gare Centrale, the city was a gleaming mosaic of wet streets, cafe awnings, and the faint smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a vendor cart. She took a taxi to the bank, Banque du Nord, an elegant limestone building with brass-framed windows and a lobby that smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Inside, the air was warm and hushed. The security guard at the door nodded but didn't stop her. At the marble counter, a clerk in a navy suit looked up. "Bonjour, madame. How may I assist you today?" Evelyn slid the brass key across the counter. "I need access to this box." The clerk checked her ID, then called over a colleague. They spoke briefly in French before leading her through a side door into a quiet hallway lined with small numbered doors. They stopped at box 317. The clerk inserted a master key alongside hers, turning both at once. The door swung open with a metallic sigh. Inside was a plain black case, no bigger than a briefcase, with a combination lock. Evelyn's breath caught. Samuel's caution was written into every layer of this. She lifted it out, surprised at its weight, and carried it to the small viewing room. The clerk closed the door behind her, leaving her alone. She hesitated, fingers on the lock. The numbers came to her in a rush, their wedding date, the same code Samuel had once used for the safe in his study. The lock clicked. Inside were two things. First, a thick manila envelope stamped confidential. She set it aside for the moment. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a hard-bound leather journal. Her stomach tightened. She recognized Samuel's handwriting immediately, embossed in faded gold on the cover. Personal ledger. She opened it, and her breath hitched. The first pages were meticulous records. Offshore transfers, asset codes, the dates properties were acquired. But halfway through, the tone shifted. Samuel's notes became personal. If you're reading this, Evelyn, I'm gone. I wish I'd told you everything sooner, but I needed you safe. The Duvals will stop at nothing to take what they think is theirs, but it isn't theirs. It's ours. And it's for the children. She turned more pages. There were names she recognized from overheard conversations at Duval family dinners, paired with dates, sums of money, and words like embezzlement, bribery, fraud. This wasn't just wealth. This was leverage. Her hands shook as she opened the manila envelope. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear enough, of Victor in a hotel suite with a woman who was definitely not his wife. Another showed Beatrice handing an envelope to a man Evelyn recognized as a city official. The date in the corner matched the approval of a lucrative Duval Holdings contract. At the bottom of the stack was a single USB drive labeled in Samuel's handwriting. If they come for you. She sat back, staring at the table. This wasn't just a safety deposit box. It was a bomb, one Samuel had buried for her to unearth when the time was right. And now she had it. Evelyn closed the case, locked it again, and returned it to the box. She didn't take everything, not yet. For now, she slipped only the USB drive into her coat pocket, hidden in the lining. She signed the bank's exit ledger with steady hands, thanked the clerk, and stepped out into the crisp Montreal air. The city moved around her, unaware that in her pocket was enough to end the Duval's reign forever. On the bus ride back, the winter sun bled into the horizon. Evelyn rested her forehead against the glass, the hum of the wheels on asphalt almost soothing. She could see the path ahead now, and it was lined not just with money, but with truth. The Duvals thought she was finished. By the time they realized otherwise, it would be far too late. The bus rolled into Burlington under a sky bruised with purple and slate. The streetlights had just flickered on, their halos shimmering in the icy air. Evelyn stepped off the last step of the bus slowly, her boots crunching on a patch of old snow, the city's familiar chill rushing up her coat sleeves. In her right pocket, the brass key rested like a spent shell casing. In her left, sewn deep into the lining of her coat, the USB drive pulsed against her palm every time she moved her hand. It wasn't heavy, yet she could feel its gravity pulling at her. She adjusted the leather portfolio under her arm and walked toward Pine Street with the kind of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks, a quiet, careful purpose, invisible to anyone passing by. Mrs. Hanley opened the apartment door before Evelyn could knock, a tea towel draped over one arm. "They were angels," she whispered, smiling. "Well, mostly angels. James asked if you were out looking for work again." Evelyn smiled faintly, unbuttoning her coat. "Something like that," she said. The warm scent of chicken stew drifted from the kitchen. In the living room, the triplets sat cross-legged on the floor, their heads bent over a puzzle that was missing two pieces. Rosalind looked up first, her face lighting like a match. Clara and James followed, scrambling over to wrap their arms around her legs. For a few minutes, Evelyn let herself melt into their warmth, listening to their chatter about the day, the puzzle, the neighbor's dog. But in the back of her mind, the USB waited, silent, patient. She tucked them into bed early, reading the same story twice at their request. When the apartment was finally quiet, she moved to the kitchen table, pulled the needle and thread from the drawer, and carefully unstitched the small pocket in her coat lining. The USB drive slid into her hand, cold from the February air. She set it on the table beside her laptop. The second-hand one she'd bought with the cash savings bond, the one Lawrence had secured for her. She hesitated for a long moment, her thumb brushing the metal. Then she powered on the laptop, the low hum of the fan filling the silence. The drive opened to a single folder named Proof. She clicked. Dozens of subfolders bloomed across the screen. Contracts, transfers, audio, video. She opened contracts first, scanned pages of property deeds, corporate agreements, and bank statements. Each one was cross-referenced with dates and codes she recognized from Samuel's leather ledger. Offshore accounts. Shell companies. Properties held under false names. Evelyn leaned closer, her fingers tracing the screen as if she could touch the ink. Every document was like a brick in a wall she was beginning to see, a wall that could trap Beatrice and Victor on the wrong side forever. Next came audio. She clicked the first file, and Samuel's voice filled the small kitchen, low and steady. "If you're hearing this, Evelyn, I trust you found the box. What you have now can't just protect you, it can end them. Be careful. They will come for you when they sense you're not broken. You have to let them think they've won, until the moment they haven't." Her eyes stung. She pressed the spacebar to pause, swallowing hard. She'd forgotten how his voice could wrap around her like a coat on a winter morning. She sat in the glow of the screen for a long time before continuing. The last file in the folder was a video. She clicked play, and the grainy image resolved into Beatrice and Victor in what looked like a private dining room. A single lamp over the table casting their faces in gold. The audio was muffled, but then Victor's voice cut through. "Once she's out, we can challenge the will. No judge in this state will side with her once we prove she's unfit. The kids will be ours. And so will the money." Evelyn froze the frame. Beatrice's mouth was curved in satisfaction, Victor leaning back like a man already counting his winnings. Her pulse steadied, not quickened. This wasn't just leverage. This was the blade she could keep sheathed until the precise moment it needed to cut. The next morning, Evelyn moved through her shift at the Champlain Trust as though the night before had never happened. She answered phones, sorted mail, and prepared coffee for the board meeting. But every action was anchored by a new awareness. She now carried something the Duvals didn't know existed, and that ignorance was her shield. She slipped the USB into the deep pocket of her cardigan before heading to the copier room. The steady whir of the machine was almost soothing, until she caught a movement in the reflection of the glass. Beatrice. She was in the lobby, dressed in a dark wool coat with a mink collar, speaking to the receptionist. Her eyes, sharp and scanning, swept over the office like searchlights. Evelyn didn't move from the copier room. She watched through the narrow slit in the blinds as Beatrice smiled politely, said something to the receptionist, and left. But Evelyn knew. This was a probe. The Duvals had caught the faintest scent that she was no longer playing dead. That evening, she locked the USB in a small fireproof box beneath her bed. The portfolio stayed hidden under the floorboard. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote in deliberate block letters. Phase 1. Beneath it, she wrote, "Keep appearance of struggle. Strengthen network quietly. Confirm all assets. Identify weak link in Duval circle." She closed the notebook and sat in the dark, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Outside, Burlington's streets gleamed wet under the streetlights. She didn't know how long the game would take. But she knew the rules now, and more importantly, she knew how to break them. The last days of February slid into March with a slow thaw. Snowbanks shrank into gritty piles, and the air carried the first hint, faint but real, that winter would loosen its grip. Evelyn moved through her days with measured precision. To Mrs. Hanley, the other tenants, and even her co-workers at the Champlain Trust, she was still the widow making ends meet. Her clothes were modest, her grocery bags light, her smile tired but polite. But at night, her kitchen table became a war room. She mapped every Duval asset she now knew about, layering Samuel's ledger notes over the digital files from the USB. She color-coded them, green for accessible, yellow for monitored, red for those too risky to touch, yet. The first opportunity came unexpectedly. A contact she'd made at the Champlain Trust, a quiet, sharp-eyed grant accountant named Mr. Harris, mentioned almost in passing, real estate broker who specialized in moving properties without drawing attention. "It's not illegal," Harris had said with a knowing glance. "It's just quieter than most people prefer." Within a week, Evelyn had arranged for a small Vermont cabin, listed under one of Samuel's shell companies, to be sold to a holding trust in her name. It wasn't worth much compared to the rest of the portfolio, but it was a test, a way to see if the Duvals were watching closely enough to notice. They were. 3 days later, Victor's name lit up on her phone. She let it ring out, then saw the text. "Call me. Now." She didn't. That evening, while walking home, she noticed a dark sedan parked across from her building. The same car was there the next morning. By the third day, it was gone. At the Duval estate, the conversation was less subtle. Beatrice paced the library, the click of her heels sharp against the parquet floor. "She's not folding the way she should. That cabin transfer? She's moving assets." Victor, sprawled in a leather armchair, waved a hand dismissively. "It's a cabin in the woods. Let her have it. We're after the big holdings." "You're not listening," Beatrice snapped. "If she's willing to move on something small, it means she's looking at the larger picture. And she has help. Someone's guiding her. Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Back in Burlington, Evelyn was making another quiet move. In the bank's small meeting room, she sat with a young attorney from Montreal, a woman she'd met through Robert Ashton's network, signing a series of trust documents. The attorney didn't ask why she wanted the terms so specific, why certain clauses locked control of assets to the triplets' names alone. She simply prepared the papers, took her fee, and left. That Friday at the Champlain Trust, Evelyn was walking past the lobby when the receptionist stopped her. "You have a visitor," she said, lowering her voice. She didn't give a name. Evelyn turned and found Beatrice standing there, perfectly dressed, a smile fixed like porcelain. "Evelyn," she said warmly, too warmly. "I thought we might have coffee." Evelyn glanced at the clock. "I'm at work." "Then I'll wait." They sat in the cafe across the street. Beatrice ordered tea, stirring it slowly before speaking. "You've been busy," she said lightly. Evelyn didn't look away. "I'm rebuilding." "That's what widows do, isn't it?" Beatrice's smile didn't falter, but her eyes cooled. "Just remember, some things are better left as they are. For everyone's sake." Evelyn took a sip of her coffee, her voice calm. "I'll keep that in mind." That night, Evelyn wrote in her notebook. Phase 2. Maintain pressure. Control the pace. I'll let them show their hand. The Duvals had made their first move. And they'd made it face to face. Now she knew they were paying attention, which meant it was time to start feeding them exactly what she wanted them to see. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was hand-delivered by a courier in a crisp navy jacket who asked her to sign before placing the envelope into her hands. The paper was thick, the kind that carried weight even before it was opened. She recognized the embossed seal immediately, Superior Court of Vermont. Her fingers tightened around the envelope as the courier left. She didn't open it right there in the kitchen, not with the triplets eating breakfast a few feet away. "Finish your cereal," she said gently, smiling so they wouldn't hear the shift in her voice. When they were out the door with Mrs. Hanley, Evelyn slid a letter opener under the flap and unfolded the pages. Petition for guardianship review. Filed by Victor Duval and Beatrice Duval. The language was dressed in legal politeness but cut like glass. Concerns regarding the well-being and proper upbringing of the minor children. Request for court review to determine the suitability of Evelyn Harper Duval as sole guardian. There it was in black and white, their first real strike. Her hands didn't tremble. If anything, the stillness in her body felt unnatural, like she was made of stone. She read every line twice, then set the papers down and stared at the small fireproof box under her bed in her mind's eye. At the Duval estate, the mood was smug. Victor poured himself a drink in the library. "It's not about winning in court," he said to Beatrice. "It's about rattling her. You rattle her, she'll make mistakes. And we'll be there to catch them." Beatrice leaned against the mantel, her smile thin. "She's already made one. That cabin transfer. And when the judge sees how she's moving assets under the children's names, it'll look suspicious enough to question her judgment." Evelyn spent the afternoon in the Champlain Trust's copier room, printing innocuous grant forms while her mind spun a different set of calculations. The Duvals wanted her rattled? Fine. She'd give them exactly what they thought they wanted, just not the way they expected. That evening, she called Robert Ashton. "I'm going to need a family law specialist," she said without preamble. "One who doesn't flinch when things get ugly." The meeting was set for 2 days later in the back room of a cafe far from the downtown law offices. Her new attorney, Marianne Cavanaugh, was younger than Evelyn expected, mid-30s, hair in a messy bun, but with eyes that missed nothing. She listened in silence as Evelyn laid out the history, from Samuel's death to the eviction, right up to the petition now sitting on her kitchen counter. "They think they can drag you through mud until you give up," Marianne said finally. "Our job is to make sure every step they take splashes right back on them." Evelyn slid the USB drive across the table. "This is everything. But it's not time to use it yet. I want them to think they're winning." Marianne raised an eyebrow, but tucked the drive into her bag without comment. "Then let's give them just enough rope." The next week moved like a chess game. The Duval's lawyer filed motions for financial disclosure. Evelyn, through Marianne, complied, but only with documents they were meant to see. Nothing from the ledger, nothing from the Montreal box. Meanwhile, Evelyn made quiet adjustments. One of the red assets on her chart, a warehouse in Montreal tied to a Duval shell company, was quietly re-registered under a dormant holding entity in her control. On paper, it looked like nothing more than an expired lease renewal. At home, She kept life normal for the triplets. They still had pancakes on Saturday mornings. They still drew pictures at the kitchen table. But when James asked, "Mommy, why did that man in the suit ask me my name the other day?" Evelyn's stomach turned cold. Someone had been near them. She kept her voice light. "Probably someone from the building, sweetheart. Don't talk to strangers unless I'm there, okay?" Inside, though, her resolve hardened. The Duvals were no longer just circling her. They were testing the fence for weaknesses. The first hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Evelyn marked it on her calendar in red ink, but her eyes were already on something else entirely. A date Samuel had underlined in the ledger, March 25th. No explanation, just that date and a single word, transfer. Whatever Samuel had been moving that day, she needed to know. Because if it was as valuable as the rest of what she'd found, it might be the perfect weapon to end the Duval's game before the court ever ruled. March 25th. The date haunted her for days. She saw it when she closed her eyes, when she stirred soup on the stove, when she folded the triplets' laundry. March 25th written in Samuel's tidy script, the single word transfer beside it. It wasn't in any of the USB files. Not in the contracts, not in the offshore transfers she'd already studied. This was something else, something Samuel had kept entirely off-grid. Evelyn started with the obvious. She retraced Samuel's travel around that time last year. She logged into his old email account, the one the Duvals didn't know she still had access to, and scrolled through the weeks surrounding March 25th. Most of it was routine business chatter, but then, 2 days before the date, there was a single booking confirmation from a private charter service in Burlington. Destination: Halifax, Nova Scotia. She remembered Samuel coming home late that night, smelling faintly of salt air and cedar. He hadn't told her where he'd been. The next day, she called Robert Ashton. "I need someone in Halifax who can pull property records." Quietly. 3 days later, she had her answer. On March 25th, Samuel had transferred ownership of a small shipyard property. Not to one of his usual shell companies, but to an individual. The name on the deed made her sit back in her chair. Duval Harper Evelyn. It was hers. He'd put it in her name without her knowledge. And the shipyard wasn't just real estate. Attached to it was a mooring license for a 48-foot yacht registered under the name the Rosalind. Her eyes burned. The boat had been named for their eldest child. She didn't have long to sit with it. That evening, as she was locking the apartment door, a man in a charcoal suit stepped out of the shadows by the stairwell. His smile was thin, his eyes cold. "Mrs. Harper Duval," he said, voice soft. "The Duval family wanted to make sure you know they're concerned. Court battles can get messy. Wouldn't want the children caught in the middle." Evelyn's grip tightened on her keys, one between her fingers like a blade. "You can tell the Duval family I'm not afraid of messes." The man's smile faltered just slightly before he turned and walked down the stairs. That night, she pulled out her notebook. "Under Phase 2, she added. "Verify shipyard security. Inspect yacht condition. A do not move asset yet. Use as leverage." 2 days later, she took an early morning bus to Halifax. The air smelled of the sea, the gulls wheeled overhead, and the shipyard office still had Samuel's handwriting on the lease documents. The Rosalind sat in her berth, paint a little faded, but beautiful. Evelyn stepped onto the deck, running her hand along the railing, feeling the solid weight of the wood beneath her palm. Below deck, she found exactly what she didn't know she'd been hoping for: a small, locked cabinet in Samuel's study area. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 things: a waterproof case containing more documents, a sealed envelope with her name on it, and a small, velvet pouch that clinked when she picked it up. She didn't open them there. Not yet. Back in Burlington that evening, she found a plain white envelope pushed under her apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Drop the case, or you'll lose more than money." No signature. No return address. Evelyn read it once, then burned it in the kitchen sink. The Duvals wanted her to be afraid. Instead, they'd just confirmed that she was getting close to something they didn't want her to find. And now she had a new card to play, one Samuel had named after their daughter. The first hearing was now less than 2 weeks away. On the surface, Evelyn's life looked much the same. School drop-offs in the morning, work at the Champlain Trust, evenings cooking simple meals with the triplets. But under that quiet rhythm, every day was a step in the careful construction of her defense. Marianne, her attorney, was methodical. "They'll try to paint you as unstable," she told Evelyn during one late-night meeting over coffee. We need records, school reports showing the kids are thriving, statements from neighbors, anyone who's seen you caring for them. Evelyn already had half of it in a neat folder. She'd been keeping it since the week after Samuel's funeral. Instinct, perhaps, or just the knowledge that with the Duvals, nothing was ever simple. Beatrice made the first uninvited move. Evelyn was walking the triplets home from school when the sleek black sedan eased up to the curb. The window rolled down and Beatrice's voice, cool as glass, drifted out. "Evelyn, the children look well." Evelyn stopped on the sidewalk, the triplets pressed close to her sides. "They are well," she said evenly. Beatrice's gaze lingered on them a moment longer than necessary. Court can be unpredictable. It's best to avoid unnecessary strain. Think carefully before dragging this out. She rolled the window up before Evelyn could answer, the sedan gliding away as silently as it had come. That night, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, the Halifax documents still locked away in her fireproof box. She wanted to use them, desperately, but Marianne's advice echoed in her mind. Not yet. Timing is everything. Instead, she focused on the smaller battles she could win now. She reached out to Mrs. Hanley, who agreed to give a statement about Evelyn's parenting and how the triplets had adjusted in the months since Samuel's death. She called the children's teachers, arranging for copies of their progress reports. Even the pediatrician sent a note, detailing their clean bills of health. At the Duval estate, Victor wasn't as patient as Beatrice. "Why are we dragging this out?" he demanded over dinner. "We hit her hard, push for an emergency ruling. The judge hands us the kids before she knows what happened." Beatrice sipped her wine. "And if she has something we don't know about? We rush, we risk her using it." "No, Victor. We keep her under pressure until she cracks. She'll make a mistake." 1 week before the hearing, Evelyn received another letter from the court, this one scheduling a home visit from a guardian ad litem. When Marian told her, Evelyn just nodded. "Let them come," she said. "They'll see exactly what they need to see." She spent the next 2 days quietly preparing the apartment. Not in an obvious way, no overdone tidiness, no staged perfection. Just the warmth and stability she'd built for the triplets since the day the Duvals threw them out. The morning of the visit, snow fell in soft flakes outside. The triplets were at school, the stew pot was simmering gently, and the guardian ad litem, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sharp pen, took her time walking through each room. By the end of the hour, she was smiling. "You've done well here," she said. "The children are fortunate to have you." Evelyn walked her to the door, her own smile calm. But inside, she felt the first quiet surge of something she hadn't let herself feel in months. Confidence. The report came 3 days later. Marian called her just after lunch. "It's good," she said, and Evelyn could hear the restrained satisfaction in her voice. "The guardian ad litem's recommendation is entirely in your favor. Stable home, strong bond with the children, no concerns about their welfare." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first clear strike against the Duvals' narrative. At the Duval estate, the mood was noticeably different. Victor paced near the window, watching the sleet lash against the glass. "We underestimated her," he muttered. Beatrice didn't look up from her tea. "No. She got lucky with a sympathetic evaluator. It happens. We keep going. The judge will see the bigger picture." But her voice lacked the crisp certainty it once had. The first crack had appeared, faint but real. Evelyn didn't waste the momentum. With Marianne's help, she began quietly gathering the next layer of her defense. The kind of evidence that would not only secure her guardianship, but also make the Duvals think twice about pursuing her further. She called on 2 former employees of Samuel's companies, people who'd been discarded by the Duvals after his death. One agreed to sign a sworn statement about unpaid benefits and questionable fund transfers Victor had authorized. The other had photographs, grainy but clear enough, of the Duvals meeting with a known corporate fixer in Montreal. "These don't go to the court yet," Marianne reminded her. "They're insurance. But the fact that we have them, that changes everything." The triplets, blissfully unaware of the legal maneuvers surrounding them, had their own small victories. Rosalind reading an entire storybook aloud, Clara learning to tie her shoes, James proudly announcing he'd scored 2 goals at recess. Evelyn held on to those moments. They were the quiet proof of why she was fighting at all. But the Duvals weren't idle. Late one evening, as Evelyn was closing up her laptop, the phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but the number was local. "Mrs. Harper Duval?" a man's voice said. "This is Detective Rowan, Burlington PD. We've had a report filed against you. Allegations of financial misconduct involving your late husband's estate. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Her stomach went cold, but her voice stayed even. "I'll have my attorney contact you." She hung up, her pulse steady but hard. It was a classic Duval move, a shadow of criminal accusation to make her look unstable before the hearing. The next morning, Marianne confirmed what Evelyn already suspected. "The report's vague, no evidence attached. It's not going anywhere legally, but they're hoping it shakes you. Don't let it." Evelyn didn't. That evening, she unlocked the fireproof box under her bed. She took out the Halifax envelope Samuel had left for her and placed it on the kitchen table. She didn't open it yet, just sat with it, the paper cool under her fingertips. The time was coming, and when it did, the Duvals would see exactly how much she'd been holding back. That Saturday morning, the triplets were still in their pajamas, sprawled on the living room floor with crayons and coloring books, when Evelyn finally opened the Halifax envelope. Inside was a single-typed page and a small brass key. The page was Samuel's doing, concise, precise. "Evelyn, if you're reading this, I can't explain everything in person. The enclosed key is to a safe deposit box at Halifax Trust and Mercantile, Box 412. You'll know what to do when you see it. S." Her fingers tightened around the key. It was heavier than it looked, its ridged edge biting into her palm. By noon, she was on the phone to Robert Ashton. "I need someone in Halifax I can trust," she said. "No paper trail back here." He didn't ask questions, just promised a name by nightfall. 3 days later, she had it. A retired shipping broker named Michael Kerr, an old friend of Samuel's who owed him more than a few favors. They arranged to meet in Halifax under the guise of reviewing old marina leases. Evelyn took the earliest bus north. The March air was sharp with salt, and the sky a flat gray when she stepped into the quiet lobby of Halifax Trust and Mercantile. The manager's eyes flickered to the key, then to Michael, and without a word, he led them into the vault. Inside the box was unexpected. 2 slim ledgers, a flash drive, and a navy blue folder stamped confidential. The ledgers were in Samuel's handwriting, columns of dates, amounts, and names, many she recognized as Duval Shell Companies. The totals at the bottom of each page made her stomach flip. This wasn't just money. It was evidence, clear, traceable proof of years of hidden transactions. On the return bus to Burlington, Evelyn kept the folder zipped deep inside her coat. She didn't need to open it yet. Knowing it existed was enough for now. Because while she was in Halifax, the Duvals had made their boldest move yet. It started with Beatrice waiting outside the children's school. Mrs. Hanley called Evelyn mid-afternoon, voice tight. "I don't mean to alarm you, dear, but Beatrice was there when I picked the kids up. Said she just wanted to talk to them. I told her it wasn't appropriate and walked them straight home." Evelyn's jaw locked. "Thank you, Mrs. Hanley. I'll handle it." That evening, she called Marianne. "I want this on record," Evelyn said. "Date, time, witnesses. If they're willing to cross that line, they'll try again." Marianne agreed. "And when they do, we'll be ready. This will not play well in front of a judge." Evelyn spent the night sorting through the Halifax ledgers, marking connections between the accounts. Every circle and arrow on the page was another thread she could pull when the moment came. But she also knew the Duvals would sense the shift, that subtle tightening of her resolve, the way a hunted animal sometimes turns and begins to stalk instead. And she was right. 2 days later, a single white card appeared under her apartment door. In careful block letters, it read, "You're in over your head. Stop now." She burned that one too, but not before smiling at it. They were nervous. And when the Duvals were nervous, they made mistakes. The week before the hearing was a blur of calculated moves. Evelyn wasn't just defending anymore. She was shaping the field, laying out bait so carefully that the Duvals wouldn't realize it wasn't the real prize until it was far too late. It began with a conversation, accidentally overheard. At the Champlain Trust, while filing reports in the shared office space, Evelyn spoke just loudly enough for the junior accountant, a known Duval sympathizer, to hear her tell Marianne over the phone. "Yes, the cabin paperwork is nearly finalized. Once the transfer clears, it should be safe." In truth, the cabin was already transferred and of little value. But she knew word would find its way back to Beatrice within hours. It did. That evening, Victor barked across the Duval dining table. "She's moving another property. Small or not, she's stripping assets." Beatrice's lips tightened. Then let her. The more she moves, the more suspicious she looks. We'll present it all at the hearing. They didn't realize the paper trail was designed to be exactly what they wanted to find. Harmless, distracting, and entirely disconnected from the Halifax evidence. Meanwhile, Evelyn kept her true preparations hidden in the quiet hours after the triplets were asleep. The Halifax ledgers were now mapped into a clean, chronological flow. Each entry tied to an account, each account to a Duval entity, each entity to transactions that skirted the edges of legality. She labeled them not with legal terms, but with emotions, greed, betrayal, cover-up. The names reminded her what this fight was really about. But the Duvals weren't content with indirect pressure. 3 days before the hearing, Evelyn stepped out of her building to find her car door slightly ajar. Nothing was stolen, but the glove compartment had been rifled through, papers scattered across the seat. The only thing missing was the envelope containing the fake cabin transfer documents she'd left there on purpose. She almost laughed. That night, Marianne called. They've filed a supplemental motion to include evidence of your so-called property shifts. They think they've caught you hiding assets. Evelyn's voice was calm. Good. Let them present it. We'll dismantle it in court, and while they're defending their own misinterpretation, we'll slide in the real evidence. The triplets sensed the tension even if they didn't understand it. Rosalind asked at bedtime, Mommy, will we still live here after you talk to the judge? Evelyn smoothed her hair. Yes, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine. And she meant it, because the Halifax key had unlocked more than a deposit box. It had given her the one thing the Duvals didn't believe she had anymore, control. By the night before the hearing, everything was in place. The decoy trail was leading them exactly where she wanted them. The Halifax documents were secure. And the people who could verify every number in those ledgers were ready to testify if she called on them. Evelyn closed her notebook and looked out at the city lights. Tomorrow, the Duvals would come expecting to corner her. Instead, they'd discover they'd been chasing a ghost. The morning of the hearing broke clear and bitterly cold. Frost webbed across the windows, and Evelyn could see her breath as she stepped onto the street. She dressed deliberately, a dark navy suit, minimal jewelry, hair pulled back neatly. Nothing flashy, nothing careless. She wanted the judge to see what she was, steady, capable, and unshaken. Outside the courthouse, the Duvals were already there. Victor stood beside their attorney, adjusting his cufflinks, while Beatrice spoke with a reporter who had shown up, notebook in hand. The sight made Evelyn's pulse slow, not quicken. They were performing for an audience. And performances, she knew, could slip. Marianne met her at the top of the steps, her own files stacked neatly in a leather case. You ready? Evelyn nodded. More than ready. They walked through the metal detectors, the click of Evelyn's heels echoing against the marble. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and old paper. The judge's bench loomed ahead, the state seal gleaming above it. Evelyn took her seat at the respondent's table, placing her hands lightly on the folder in front of her. Not the Halifax folder, that was still locked away, but the one that contained the building blocks of her visible case. The Guardian ad litem's report, school records, witness statements. Across the aisle, Victor leaned toward Beatrice, smirking as if they'd already won. Their attorney, a tall man with slick-back hair, flipped through a binder like a preacher readying his sermon. When the judge entered, everyone stood. His eyes were sharp but tired, his voice clipped as he called the case. The Duval's attorney rose first, speaking in a measured, confident tone. Your Honor, we are here because our clients have serious concerns about the welfare of their late son's children. Evelyn kept her gaze forward, her face composed, but she felt Marianne's quiet tap on her arm. Their silent signal that all was proceeding exactly as expected. The opening statements were just as she'd anticipated. Polished accusations wrapped in concern, subtle digs about financial irregularities and instability in housing. All designed to plant seeds in the judge's mind. When they finished, Marianne stood. Her voice was calm, deliberate. Your Honor, my client has cared for her children with unwavering dedication since the day they were born. The evidence will show that they are thriving under her care, and that the petition before you is not born of genuine concern, but of other interests entirely. The judge made a note, then gestured for the first witness to be called. Evelyn glanced at the Duvals briefly, just enough to meet Beatrice's eyes, and then returned her gaze to the front. Because this was only the beginning, and the Duvals didn't yet realize that every move they were about to make in this courtroom was leading them straight into the trap she'd set. The bailiff called the first witness, Mrs. Hanley. Evelyn felt the tightness in her chest ease just a fraction. Mrs. Hanley was solid, unshakable. A woman who had known her and the triplets for years, who had seen both joy and hardship without ever flinching. Mrs. Hanley walked to the stand in her neat gray skirt and pressed blouse, her posture straight despite the stiffness in her knees. She swore the oath with a clear voice, then settled into the witness chair, folding her hands gently in her lap. The Duval's attorney approached first. "Mrs. Hanley, you've known the respondent for how long?" "Nearly 8 years," she replied without hesitation. "Since before the triplets were born." "And you live in the same building?" "Same floor." He gave a polite smile, the kind meant to suggest warmth while coaxing doubt. "In your time as neighbors, have you ever seen Evelyn distressed? Struggling with the children?" Mrs. Hanley's eyes didn't waver. "Of course I've seen her tired. She's raising 3 children after all. But struggling to care for them? No. She's attentive, loving, and they're well looked after." The attorney's smile cooled just a fraction. "Have you ever witnessed disagreements between her and the Duval family?" "Yes. And in my opinion, those disagreements were not about the children's well-being, but about control." A ripple went through the courtroom. When it was Marianne's turn, she didn't waste time. "Mrs. Hanley, can you tell the court about the day Mrs. Harper Duval and her children were asked to leave the Duval home?" Mrs. Hanley's voice sharpened. "They weren't asked, they were told. With no notice, no offer of assistance. 3 small children and their mother, standing in the cold with suitcases. I let them into my apartment that night. They had nowhere else to go. The silence in the room was thick. Even the judge's pen paused mid-note. When Mrs. Hanley stepped down, Evelyn caught her eye and mouthed a silent thank you. The Duval's attorney called a second witness, a former household employee from the estate, clearly chosen to paint Evelyn as aloof and ungrateful. The woman's answers were hesitant, peppered with phrases like, "I can't recall," and "I think so," but the Duval's lawyer pushed ahead, trying to construct an image of someone detached from her own children. Marianne dismantled it methodically. "You said you worked at the estate for 9 months?" "Yes. During that time, how often did you personally care for the triplets?" "Well, I was mostly in the kitchen." "So your knowledge of their care was limited to what you assumed, not what you directly observed." The woman's gaze dropped. "Yes. By the midday recess, the momentum had shifted. The Duvals still sat straight-backed and confident, but Beatrice's gaze kept drifting toward Evelyn with a sharpness that hadn't been there that morning. Marianne leaned close as they gathered their things. "This is going our way. Keep your composure. We're not even to the hard evidence yet." Evelyn nodded, her calm intact, but inside, she was already thinking of the Halifax ledgers waiting in the wings. The Duvals believed this was just a guardianship fight. They still didn't see the storm she was leading them toward. After lunch, the court reconvened, and the Duval's attorney rose with a certain flourish. "Your Honor, the petitioners call Beatrice Duval." Beatrice walked to the stand with the elegance of someone who had spent a lifetime being watched. Her tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, a pearl brooch catching the courtroom light. She swore the oath smoothly, then folded her hands as though she were seated in her own drawing room. The attorney began gently. "Mrs. Duval, can you describe your relationship with your late son's children?" "They are my blood, my legacy," Beatrice said, her voice measured. "I've loved them since the day they were born. But I have deep concerns about their current environment." "What concerns specifically?" "Stability. Structure. My son came from a home where order and discipline were valued. I worry they are not receiving the same foundation now." Her gaze flicked briefly toward Evelyn, but it was calculated, a glance meant to suggest pity more than animosity. Marianne rose slowly, as though unhurried by the weight of what was coming. "Mrs. Duval, you testified that you love your grandchildren?" "Of course. And yet, on January 14th, approximately 3 weeks after your son's death, you instructed your household staff to place them and their mother outside in sub-freezing temperatures?" Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's an oversimplification. We had reached an impasse. An impasse that left 3 small children without shelter for the night?" Beatrice shifted slightly in her seat. "They had options." "Indeed," Marianne said, letting the pause hang just long enough. "The option to rely on the kindness of a neighbor, because their own grandmother had turned them away." A faint murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge's eyes lifted from his notes. If Beatrice was composed, Victor was all sharp edges and contained frustration when he took the stand. His jaw was tight, his answers clipped. On direct, he painted a picture of Evelyn as financially reckless, claiming she'd moved assets without consultation. On cross, Marianne dismantled it piece by piece. Mr. Duval, these so-called asset transfers. You're aware they involved a property already sold months before your brother's passing? That's what she claims. No, sir. That's what the official registry confirms. I have certified copies here for the court. Victor's nostrils flared. She's clever with paperwork. That doesn't mean she's fit to raise those children. Marianne didn't take the bait. She simply turned to the judge. No further questions at this time. By the time Victor stepped down, the Duval's polished image had dulled at the edges. They were still standing tall, but the subtle tells were there, the tightened mouths, the restless fingers, the darting glances toward their lawyer. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her expression neutral. Inside, she felt the momentum sliding further into her hands. Because the more they talked, the more the cracks showed, and soon she'd have exactly the leverage she needed to break them wide open. When Victor stepped down, the judge leaned back in his chair, tapping the end of his pen against the desk. His gaze moved from the petitioner's table to Evelyn's. Before we proceed further, he said, I want clarity on these financial allegations. We've heard vague references to asset transfers, instability, and questionable activity. I want specifics. Dates, amounts, and proof, not assumptions. The Duval's attorney rose immediately. Your Honor, we have documents. The judge held up a hand. You'll present them in due course. But I will warn all parties now. Hearsay and speculation will hold no weight in my decision. The warning hung in the air like a drawn curtain. Marianne rose next, her tone crisp but respectful. Your Honor, we welcome that scrutiny. My client has nothing to hide. In fact, we've brought complete documentation of her financial activity for the last 12 months, including official registry records for the property transfers in question. She slid a thick folder across to the bailiff, who carried it up to the bench. The judge flipped through the pages, his eyes skimming the dates, the stamps, the signatures. He looked up at the Duval's counsel. These appear to contradict your claim that Mrs. Harper Duval recently moved assets. The attorney's jaw tightened. We'll need time to review. You'll have it, the judge said. But be advised, if you can't support these allegations with verified records, they will be dismissed. Evelyn sat still, her hands folded loosely on the table. She could feel Beatrice's gaze drilling into her from across the aisle, the way a predator studies prey it suddenly realizes might bite back. When the court recessed briefly, Marianne leaned in. This is the opening we needed. The judge is signaling he's not impressed with their financial smears. And if they keep pushing? Evelyn asked quietly. Marianne gave the smallest of smiles. Then we give them something real to chew on, just not all of it. Back in session, Marianne began to methodically walk the court through Evelyn's stability. Verified income from her position at the Champlain Trust. A fixed, affordable lease with no arrears. School reports showing the triplets' consistent attendance and improvement. Each document was handed up, each point a nail in the coffin of the Duval's instability narrative. By the end of the day, the Duvals looked less certain. Beatrice's hands were clasped too tightly in her lap. Victor's foot tapped under the table. Evelyn didn't gloat. She simply gathered her files, thanked Marianne, and walked out with the same quiet composure she'd walked in with. But in her mind, she was already thinking ahead, to the moment she'd open the Halifax folder in this very courtroom and watch the Duval's composure shatter. The next morning, the Duvals came in early, their attorney carrying a slimmer binder than before but with a determined look. Evelyn knew the posture. They were coming in with what they believed was a strike that could still tilt the field. When court came to order, the attorney stood. Your Honor, in light of yesterday's developments, my clients wish to introduce additional testimony regarding undisclosed accounts belonging to Mrs. Harper Duval's late husband. We believe these accounts demonstrate mismanagement and possible concealment of assets relevant to the children's welfare. Evelyn kept her eyes on the judge, not on Beatrice's thin smile. The judge's brow furrowed. Do you have verifiable account records? We have witness testimony from a financial consultant who reviewed statements on behalf of the Duval family. Statements, the judge repeated. Are they certified copies from the institutions in question? The attorney hesitated. Not yet, Your Honor, but... Then your witness can speak to process and opinion, but I will treat it as such. Let's proceed. A man in his late 40s took the stand, describing in careful but vague terms accounts that had moved significant sums shortly before Samuel's death. He admitted, under Marianne's questioning, that he had not seen the original documents, only summaries provided by Victor Duval. Marian didn't press for more. She didn't need to. The damage to the Duval's credibility was already done. Then she shifted the ground. Your Honor, my client is aware of her late husband's accounts. In fact, she has undertaken her own due diligence to ensure that all relevant financial matters are accounted for. She has documentation, certified by the originating institution, that she is prepared to submit at the court's request. Marian didn't look at Evelyn. She didn't have to. The words were bait. Evelyn sat motionless, her expression unreadable, but she saw it, the flicker in Beatrice's eyes, the tightening in Victor's jaw. They'd heard certified by the originating institution, and they knew. Or at least they suspected. The judge glanced between them. Very well. If such documentation exists, it will be admissible when we move to that phase. For now, let's stay with the guardianship issues. But the shift had happened. The Duvals no longer leaned back in quiet confidence. They were forward now, tense, waiting for the other shoe to drop. When court adjourned that day, Evelyn stepped outside into the pale winter sun. Marian fell into step beside her. You saw their faces, she murmured. I did. Good. Let them wonder. The more they imagine what's in that folder, the more likely they'll make a mistake. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest smile. The Halifax ledgers were still locked away, untouched since she'd catalogued them. But now the Duvals knew there was something, and the waiting would eat at them. The apartment was quiet after the triplets had gone to bed, the kind of stillness that feels almost fragile, as if one wrong sound might shatter it. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the Halifax folder in front of her, unopened for weeks. The brass key lay beside it, catching the light from the small lamp. She turned it over in her hand, tracing its ridged edges the way she used to trace Samuel's fingers when they lay together in bed. The night pressed in around her, the city noise muted, distant. Her thoughts went back to that first month after Samuel's death. The shock, the suffocating grief, the humiliation of being put out into the cold with the children, and the raw fear of not knowing how they'd survive. She remembered Rosalind waking from nightmares, sobbing that Daddy was lost and couldn't find them. Remembered sitting in the bathroom at 3 a.m. with the water running, so the children wouldn't hear her cry. And she remembered Lawrence's voice a month after the funeral, calm, deliberate, telling her there were things Samuel had left behind that she needed to know. Her hand rested on the folder now, and she thought about what was inside. Not just numbers and signatures, but proof. Proof that Samuel had trusted her enough to hide this where only she could find it. Proof that the Duvals' wealth wasn't all clean. Proof that they were not the pillars of respectability they pretended to be. She thought of Beatrice's voice in court, dripping with condescension, calling herself the children's legacy. Thought of Victor, sneering about her supposed recklessness. Her pulse steadied. The fear was gone. She rose and crossed to the triplets' bedroom. The small nightlight threw soft shapes across the walls. Rosalind's hair spilled over her pillow, James clutched his stuffed bear, and little Clara slept with one hand curled under her cheek. They didn't know about the battle raging just beyond their small world. And they didn't need to. That was her job. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, listening to their even breathing, then whispered, "Tomorrow I finish this." Back at the table, she opened the folder. The scent of paper and ink hit her, familiar now, but still carrying weight. She paged through the ledgers, the columns of numbers, the dates, the transfers between Duval companies. Every line was a thread, and tomorrow she would weave them into a net so tight the Duvals wouldn't be able to slip through. She placed the folder into her bag, zipped it shut, and slid the brass key into her jacket pocket. There would be no more hiding. By morning, the Duvals would realize that the game they'd been playing in court wasn't the real one. And Evelyn was ready to show them the rules had just changed. The courtroom felt different that morning. Quieter. Denser. Evelyn noticed it the moment she stepped in. The Duvals were already seated, but not relaxed. Beatrice's hands were folded too tightly, and Victor's eyes kept darting toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in with bad news. They didn't know what was coming, but they felt it. The judge opened the session briskly. "We will resume with financial matters relevant to guardianship. Counsel for the respondent, you indicated yesterday there was certified documentation you wished to submit." Marian stood. "Yes, Your Honor." My client has in her possession certified records from Halifax Trust, originating directly from the institution, showing accounts and transfers connected to the late Samuel Harper Duval, and to entities controlled by the petitioners. The ripple in the gallery was immediate. Even the court reporter glanced up. Beatrice's chin lifted. This is outrageous. The judge's gavel struck once. Mrs. Duval, you will remain silent unless addressed. Victor shifted in his seat, muttering something to their attorney, whose expression had already tightened. Marianne approached the bench, handing the bailiff the Halifax folder. Evelyn watched the judge as he opened it, his eyes scanning the first page, then the second. By the third, his brows had drawn together. These are substantial figures, he said at last. And the transactions appear to predate the late Mr. Harper Duval's passing by several years. Yes, Your Honor, Marianne said evenly. The records show transfers from Duval-owned companies into private accounts, and from there into an account naming my client as a contingent beneficiary. These records were never disclosed to her by the petitioners. The Duval's attorney rose, voice tight. Your Honor, we have not had time to review. Then you will be given that time, the judge cut in. But understand, if this evidence is verified, it bears directly on the credibility of the petitioners and their claims. Beatrice's face had gone pale. Victor leaned forward, whispering fiercely to the attorney. Evelyn didn't look at them. She kept her gaze on the judge, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Marianne wasn't done. Your Honor, we also have sworn statements from Halifax Trust officers verifying the authenticity of these records. We are prepared to call them as witnesses if needed. That landed like a stone in still water. No one spoke for a moment. Finally, the judge closed the folder. We will recess for 30 minutes to allow counsel for the petitioners to review. Court will reconvene at 11 sharp. As the judge left the bench, Evelyn allowed herself a slow breath. She could feel the shift, not just in the case, but in the air. The Duvals had walked into this courtroom believing they were in control. Now they knew they weren't. And by the time the day was over, she intended to make sure they never would be again. When court reconvened after the recess, the Duval's attorney stood with the Halifax folder still in his hands. He didn't look as confident as he had that morning. Your Honor, he began, while we acknowledge receipt of these records, we question their relevance to the matter at hand. Guardianship proceedings are not the proper venue for untangling historical financial dealings. The judge fixed him with a level stare. If those financial dealings bear on the petitioner's credibility and motives, they are relevant. Proceed. The attorney turned toward Evelyn. Mrs. Harper Duval, isn't it true that you knew of these accounts for some time and deliberately chose not to disclose them until now? Evelyn's voice was calm even. I knew of the accounts, yes, but I did not have full documentation until Halifax Trust provided it to me directly. I was not going to present hearsay or incomplete information to this court. And why now? Why at this stage? Because the petitioners opened the door when they accused me of mismanaging or concealing assets. I am here to show the truth, not just for myself, but for my children. Marianne rose for redirect, her tone like tempered steel. Mrs. Harper Duval, who first told you these Halifax accounts existed? Samuel, before he died. And did he tell you why he hadn't shared them with his family? Evelyn hesitated, then said softly, because he didn't trust them. That sentence landed like a blow. Victor's head snapped toward her, eyes blazing. Beatrice's hand clutched at the pearl brooch on her lapel. Marianne continued, Your Honor, these funds are not some distant relic. They were actively growing and intended to provide for Mrs. Harper Duval and the children. The petitioner's attempt to gain guardianship would give them access to those funds, which they failed to disclose existed. The judge's face was unreadable, but he made another note in the margin of his docket. Very well. We will continue. The rest of the afternoon was a slow erosion of the Duval's composure. Every time their attorney tried to downplay the Halifax records, Marianne tied it back to credibility. Every attempt to paint Evelyn as unstable was countered with documents, witnesses, and hard facts. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, the Duvals weren't speaking to each other. Their attorney gathered his things with clipped movements, the Halifax folder still under his arm like it might burn through the leather case. Outside, Marianne let out a long breath. They're cornered now. They know it. Evelyn looked out over the courthouse steps where the pale winter light was fading. Good, she said quietly, because I'm not done yet. The final day of testimony had ended. No more witnesses. No more surprise evidence. Just the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that could never be taken back. The judge called for closing statements. Counsel for the petitioners, you may proceed. The Duval's attorney rose, adjusting his jacket before stepping forward. Your Honor, this case is not about bitterness or accusations. It is about 3 young children who deserve the stability and security of a household they can rely on. My clients, Beatrice and Victor Duval, have both the resources and the experience to provide that environment. He gestured briefly toward Evelyn, his tone measured but pointed. We do not question the respondent's love for her children, but love alone is not enough. Children need structure, financial stability, and the assurance that their guardians can manage their affairs responsibly. We urge the court to place these children where their future is most secure. He returned to his seat, his face composed but tight. Marianne stood slowly, almost deliberately, giving the room a moment to settle before she spoke. Your Honor, the petitioners have painted a picture of concern. But concern is not the same as truth. Over the past days, this court has heard the truth, in sworn testimony, in certified documents, and in the words of the petitioners themselves. She stepped toward the bench. We have seen that 3 weeks after her husband's death, Mrs. Harper Duval was turned out of her home with 3 small children. We have seen that the same petitioners who now claim to want stability were willing to subject those children to instability of the worst kind, homelessness in the middle of winter. Her voice hardened. We have seen the Halifax records, evidence the petitioners would prefer the court ignore. Records that show funds Samuel Harper Duval set aside for his wife and children. Funds the petitioners did not disclose when they sought control of these children's lives. Marian took a breath, then shifted tone, softer now, but every word clear. Your Honor, my client is not perfect. None of us are. But she is their mother. She is the person Samuel trusted to raise them, protect them, and love them. And she has done exactly that, without the resources she should have had, and in the face of calculated opposition from her in-laws. She turned, looking briefly at Beatrice and Victor before facing the bench again. Love may not be enough on its own, but love backed by integrity, truth, and the legal right to protect one's children, that is enough. That is more than enough. The courtroom was silent when she returned to her seat. Evelyn sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart was steady. The judge nodded once. I will review the evidence and render my decision within the week. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck, but the echo in the room was more than wood on wood. It was the sound of a door closing on the Duval's version of the story. The days after court adjourned felt longer than the trial itself. The official word from Marianne was simple. The judge will take as long as he needs. But for Evelyn, every hour without a decision felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unable to see what lay below. At home, life tried to resume its ordinary rhythms, school drop-offs, evening baths, late-night bills. But the uncertainty wrapped around her like a weight she couldn't put down. Some nights she'd lie awake, listening to the muted sounds of the city outside the apartment window, her mind looping through every argument, every glance from the judge, every flicker of uncertainty she'd seen on the Duval's faces. The triplets seemed blissfully unaware of the stakes, but their questions cut deep. When can we go home? Rosalind asked one night. Evelyn smoothed her daughter's hair and whispered, Soon, sweetheart. Soon. Marianne called midweek. They've filed a supplemental brief, she said, voice tight. What does that mean? It means they're trying to squeeze in one last shot before the decision. They're arguing that your introduction of the Halifax records was an ambush, and they're asking the judge to strike them from consideration. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Can they do that? They can try. But the records are certified and relevant. This is desperation, Evelyn. They're throwing anything they can at the wall. Word filtered back to her through a mutual acquaintance. Beatrice had been on the phone every day, speaking with old friends in the legal and financial circles, pressing for information, calling in favors. Victor, meanwhile, was said to have been at the Halifax branch in person, though what he hoped to achieve there no one could say. The knowledge didn't frighten Evelyn, it steeled her. If they were still fighting this hard outside of court, it meant they knew they'd lost the inside game. On the 5th night, Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, washing the dinner plates, when she caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window. She didn't look like the woman who'd stood shivering on the Duval's front steps that winter night. She looked like someone who'd learned how to fight and win without losing herself. Let them do what they want, she murmured. It won't change the truth. And for the first time since the trial began, she slept deeply. The call came early on a Thursday. Marianne's voice was brisk. "The judge has scheduled his ruling for 2 o'clock this afternoon. Be ready." The rest of the morning passed in a haze. Evelyn dressed the triplets, packed their lunches, and sent them off with Mrs. Halpern from next door, who promised to keep them until evening. She wanted the children spared from the courtroom, whatever happened. The courthouse steps felt steeper than before. Inside, the hallway outside the family court was thick with low voices, the shuffle of shoes, the occasional clack of a closing file. The Duvals were already there. Beatrice wore a steel-gray suit, her pearl brooch gleaming like a badge of rank. Victor stood beside her, his expression unreadable, but the tightness around his mouth gave him away. Evelyn met neither of their eyes as she walked past and took her seat beside Marianne. When the judge took the bench, the room seemed to still itself. He shuffled a stack of papers, cleared his throat, and began. "This court has considered the petition for guardianship of Rosalind, William, and Clara Harper Duval, brought by Beatrice and Victor Duval against their mother, Evelyn Harper Duval. We have weighed testimony, examined evidence, and reviewed the applicable law." His tone was steady, almost impersonal, but each word felt like it hung suspended in the air. "The petitioners have demonstrated a genuine concern for the welfare of the children. However, the court finds that certain actions taken by the petitioners, immediately following the death of Samuel Harper Duval, undermine the stability they claim to offer. Removing the children from their mother's home in the midst of bereavement and winter was not, in the court's view, in their best interests." Beatrice's head tilted slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to say it aloud. The judge continued. "Furthermore, the financial evidence presented, particularly the certified Halifax trust records, raises substantial concerns about the petitioner's transparency and motives. These concerns weigh heavily against granting the petition." Victor shifted, whispering sharply to their attorney, who remained motionless. "It is therefore the judgment of this court that the petition for guardianship is denied. Full legal and physical custody of Rosalind, James, and Clara Harper Duval shall remain with their mother, Evelyn Harper Duval. The petitioners are granted supervised visitation, to be arranged at mutually agreed times." The gavel struck once. "This matter is concluded." Evelyn's breath left her in a rush she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Marianne touched her arm, just once, before starting to gather the files. Across the aisle, Beatrice's face was carved from ice. Victor looked down, jaw clenched. Evelyn stood, smoothing her skirt, and walked out without a backward glance. Outside, the cold air hit her face, sharp and clean. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight she'd carried for months finally, truly lift. "We're going home," she whispered to herself. And this time she meant it. When Evelyn reached Mrs. Hanley's apartment, the triplets were sprawled on the living room floor, building a crooked tower out of wooden blocks. Clara was the first to see her. "Mommy," she squealed, scrambling to her feet and running into her arms. James and Rosalind followed, wrapping themselves around her legs with such force she almost lost her balance. Evelyn dropped to her knees, pulling all three of them close, breathing them in as if she could anchor herself to the smell of their hair and the sound of their giggles. Mrs. Hanley smiled from the doorway. "By the look on your face, I take it things went well." Evelyn laughed, a sound that came easier now. "Better than well. We're going home." They didn't have far to go, just 3 blocks, but the walk felt different today. The winter light was pale, the air cold, but Evelyn noticed things she hadn't before. The soft hum of a shop's heater spilling warmth into the street, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner, the way James's mittened hand fit so perfectly into hers. Rosalind skipped ahead, singing a song she'd made up, while Clara chattered about the picture she'd drawn that morning. It wasn't a grand procession, but to Evelyn it felt like a triumphal march. The front door to their apartment stuck as it always did, but when it gave way, the warmth of home wrapped around them. It wasn't the grand house the Duvals had tried to hold over her, but it was theirs. The triplets scattered instantly, Rosalind to her stack of books, James to his cars, Clara to the corner where her drawings covered the wall. Evelyn set her bag down, the brass key from Halifax still inside. She'd keep it, not because she needed it now, but because it was a reminder of Samuel's trust, of her own strength, and of the truth that had carried them through. She walked to the window, looking out at the street below. For months, the view had felt like a cage, the limits of a life she hadn't chosen. Now it looked different. It looked like the starting point of something new. She thought of Samuel, of his laugh, his stubbornness, the quiet ways he had tried to protect her even when he wasn't sure he could. "We're okay," she whispered. "You can rest now." The triplets' laughter spilled into the room, pure and unguarded. Evelyn turned toward them, a smile tugging at her lips. Tomorrow there would still be bills to pay, lunches to pack, and late nights to get through. But tonight, there was this, a small apartment filled with warmth, safety, and the people who mattered most. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she knew they were truly, completely free. Sometimes, life hides its greatest battles behind closed doors. The ones where no one sees the sleepless nights, the quiet tears, or the choices made in the space between hope and fear. Evelyn Harper Duval never asked for the fight that came after Samuel's death. She never asked to stand in a courtroom, her motherhood questioned, her loyalty doubted, her future hanging by a thread. But she stood anyway. She faced the people who should have stood beside her, and instead tried to break her. She faced the weight of loss, of uncertainty, of betrayal. And she walked away, not just with her children, but with her dignity, her truth, and the knowledge that Samuel's trust had not been misplaced. For months, she had been unaware of what Samuel had quietly set aside for her and the triplets. And when she learned, it became more than an inheritance. It became a lifeline, a shield, proof that love, real love, leaves something behind even when the person is gone. Her in-laws had thrown her out, certain they could take everything. But in the end, they lost the one thing they could never buy, never claim, never touch: her children's unwavering love for their mother. And as Evelyn watched Rosalind, James, and Clara play on the living room floor that night, she understood something with a clarity she would carry forever. They were home. They were safe. And no one, not even those who once called themselves family, would ever take that away again.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and more intriguing than you can ever imagine.